Hey, Chris
Hello.
Flynn. Hello, Chris Flynn. I'm excited to talk to you about your role on Attack of the Show for Attack of the Doc. How are you doing?
Pretty good. Still locked down.
We're all still locked down. So you've got to get creative with your production methods when you're locked down, which is why we're approaching the documentary this way. I've had to reapproach it. We were just talking before we started recording that the double gut punch of, the pandemic happens just as we're starting production. We had set up a whole studio to record interviews with everyone and then had to shut it down. And then the other gut punch, which was G4 coming back, which changes kind of the approach to the doc. But before I ask the first question, Chris Flynn, you have an amazing blog that there's still lots of, and a YouTube channel called Front Row Flynn.
Yep.
Look up Front Row Flynn. You can find the YouTube channel. You can find the social media feed where you don't always get front row, but you do your best to go to a lot of events where like some pretty amazing guests and people are you're recording and documenting Q&As of screenings. So I just wanted to put that plug in for you so you don't have to.
Thanks. Yeah, no, it's been a fun, just like the documentary, the channel kind of got a gut punch with COVID, because no more movie screenings, but it's also a great archive of what it used to be like to go to the movies. How it used to be cool to go do these fun screenings with the filmmakers and the actors, and the challenge of getting the front row. Not always, but for the most part, I try.
No, you did, and I watched many of your interviews. It was, it was great. Like it was just like, because I feel like those Q&As are things where people really kind of feel like off the cuff, like they can just, really, have fun because it's not like they're doing a television show. There's not any weight behind it, so I think they're more free to express themselves. But let's talk about Attack of the Show and you and your role. What was your exact title and position, and how did you get that job on Attack of the Show? And exactly there are titles for jobs, but what exactly did you do?
I was a technical director from 2006 until the show wrapped. We were wrapped in 2012, just before Christmas. And then, technically we were still employed until 2013, there in January. I came in because people had been telling me that there was always an opening at G4, and I had started freelancing that summer and started wanting to do more entertainment type shows. And I liked the idea of G4 because I'm really into video games. So I said, well, this could be a lot of fun, and go. So I got there to find out that the current technical director was leaving, and they were going to have freelancers just cover it for a few months. And so, we tried it out, see how it went. And then they ended up asking me to stay. And then I kind of backed out again for a little bit, and somebody took over full time, but then they were merging with E to go up to the E Network studios. And that was a better commute for me. And I had a long relationship with E, so I could help with the merger between the two because I knew the technical operations for E and how they did things. And I knew how G4 did things. And I could kind of help, smooth it all out together. So they ended up asking me to stay on after the merger. And I stayed until the ship went down, until it was all over.
Tell me about, you say the word technical director. What do you exactly do?
I always say Mongo push button, Mongo pawn and game of life. I have a large console in front of me where I'll have all the video sources, and then I'll also have several banks to work with to build effects and pre-build effects and settings. So like around the net, the animation would always be a key, and it would be tied to an effect. And so I would, when they would give me the cue, the director would tell me, and run it, and I would run the effect. Animation would come in, there would be a transition underneath, and, then it would come out the other side. That was always something that was pre-set up, in an effects bank, or the change in the monitors, were set up in an effects bank. The over-the-shoulder, with the little video box saying coming up today, was in an effects bank. And, the director would tell me, okay, take camera 2, take camera 4, okay, put in the graphic, take out the graphic. And you see, a bunch of clips of this online with like directors, like there's a great clip somebody put up of Lou Horowitz doing the Oscars, and it focuses on him directing. But if you look carefully, the technical director is sitting next to him, pushing the buttons, doing everything he's doing. And sometimes it can be very leisurely, and sometimes it can be very hectic and very crazy. But it's kind of managing all that, building the effects for the show. So Adam Jenkins was our graphics designer, and he would design all of the really cool animations and things like that and send it down to me, and then I would have to make it work as an effect, and pre-build that. And then also just kind of being management's, overseeing of the crew, any crew issues, time cards, meals, things like that. If the crew had a problem, they would come to me first, and then I would take the management.
You're kind of like Sulu. There's a giant console, because I've seen you at that console, and I remember, you're just like, so that actually gave you kind of a glimpse into goings on between shooting. You got to see a lot of things. I really love to hear from you, and man, it's, that's like more than 6 years worth of highlights that didn't make the show that you were privy to. And I wonder if you would tell us some of those stories, like first appearances of people. What are some of the things that stood out? I know before we started recording that you mentioned some of those highlights. Can you tell those individual stories of things that occurred on set that you got to witness that were just kind of fun, the kind of things that would like break the tension? And one of the things I know that like Kevin would do would be to show something from his phone that was completely inappropriate to you just before we went live, as a way to kind of like, it was actually a really smart way to kind of like make you not be nervous, because it just distracted your brain from anything else. But can you give me like just a series of stories about some of those highlights? Give us some of those in brief.
Yeah, Kevin, he had all of this stuff, but it was also kind of, subversive 4chan kind of stuff. It was always like, very blue. We say that people play blue, and kind of, dark comedy, kind of stuff, which was great. It was always really good for big laughs. And so he was off one day, and Olivia was on the set by herself, and we were in rehearsals, and he had emailed her and insisted that she open up this link because it was something really good and everybody had to see it. And so they insisted that I put it up on the monitor, and she opened it up, and it was Two Girls, One Cup, which if anybody's familiar, with it, is pretty graphic, and it got graphic pretty quickly. And then we had to take it off the main monitor and just leave it on the preview monitor, because now it was going out to the lobby for E and to all the E monitors. And if you've seen Two Girls, One Cup, you don't want that going out to everybody. So, that was a big laugh. I mean, we were all just laughing and laughing, and it was nice that he was there in spirit that day, even though he wasn't physically on the set. So that was a pretty good one. And I think we talked a little bit, John Barrowman, from Doctor Who and Torchwood, and he was a great guest host, and he was filling in for a while toward the end. And I guess he has this gag that he does on every show that he works on, where he'll just only put his testicles out, and everybody laughs. And normally it goes over pretty well, and everybody gets a good, laugh out of it. We did it, and all of a sudden everybody's looking at the monitor going, "Is that a prosthetic? Did he get some kind of fake testicles or something?" And Andy, the stage manager, goes, "Nope, those are his. It's real." And we had to take it off the monitor because it was going out again to the E lobby. And so everybody in the E lobby, which sometimes was Kardashians or Kardashian fans or people, business people, things. And they're seeing John Barrowman's, ball sack hanging out. And that was pretty funny. Just, a lot of things like that. I'm trying to think,
just to jog your memory, I know that there was a lot of hijinks.
Oh yeah.
Incredible hijinks. What other stuff do you recall that are some of the things that were like, just to kind of like break the ice? I mean, there were a lot of things. I think it was a very, very loose, fun set.
Yeah, I mean, it was always a fun gig to come into because, as I always say, there are only so many jobs that you could have come into, and you get an email at 11 o'clock in the morning saying, okay, today we're going to have a sushi chef, 4 Japanese harpooners, a ninja, a wizard, and a mariachi band today. And that's just today. And so we have to be able to kind of be ready for all that. And then it actually happens on the set. So you spend the day trying to figure it out, or you get the email and say, well, this is going to be a fun bit today. That we're just when we did the piñata full of mayonnaise, for Cinco de Mayo. And we tried to do the one for St. Patrick's Day with the piñata full of corned beef, and that didn't go well. That was a bad thing. And then I'm trying to think of.
Well, yeah, you have to talk about the pie.
Oh my God, the pie! Yeah, I mean, we found out, okay, Olivia's going to be jumping into this giant pie, and we had bought out every can of pudding in the LA area, the big industrial sized cans. And then somebody realized that we had to do whipped cream, and so we ran down the street to Ralph's, and they bought everything of whipped cream and Cool Whip and everything you can imagine, put it all on this cow trough that had like a fake pie crust put on it. And it was just this huge, project in the studio. And then nobody thought to put down padding. So when Olivia jumped in, she went knees first. She smacked onto that ground and hit it. And, luckily she hit it, but she was, pretty hurt. And then Kevin jumped in. He kind of went in more diving, style. So, he landed more on his butt. But apparently the pudding got into everything. It got into their ears, their nose. And so they had to get everything cleaned out, and do that. And then it took 2 days with a septic truck to actually empty that whole thing out and get rid of it. And by then the studio stunk really bad because all this pudding and all the whipped cream and everything, it just gone horribly wrong. But we had a $275,000 monitor wall behind them. If you ever notice that clip, it's covered with a big American flag because we said, we can't lose that monitor wall covering it in pudding. John Gardner was the handheld camera guy. He got covered in pudding, and his camera got covered in pudding. That's still one of the favorite days that, whenever I'm working with somebody from Attack, and we always talk about the pie jump, especially Genji, the director, that, I cut his demo reel, and we got to have the pie. We got to keep the pie in there. And, but when Kevin ripped off his suit and revealed that he was wearing the French-made costume too, and he was going to jump in the pie, that was a surprise. So that was a lot of fun. That was probably overall, that was probably the best day, on Attack. And then it kind of went downhill a bit from there, but we still had fun right up until the end, because we did the Kevin Pereira's Clubhouse, the bit that was the parody from, there was a whole week of parodies from UHF, the Weird Al movie. And I'm a huge fan of that movie. So I loved it. That whole week, we were just doing everything, from the movie. And it was just great. But that was the pinnacle because we actually set it up like Stanley Spadowski's Clubhouse. And we had the giant pool of oatmeal and the horse and the hose, for shooting the fire hose thing, and the car, and you could drive around and the whole thing. And it's just going out. I'm standing in the middle of Stanley Spadowski's Clubhouse. But at the same time, the compliance people for E Network were standing over on the side going, this is the last thing you guys do like this. There's a whole bunch of liability issues here with this. And so this is the last big stunt you're going to do. And then that's going to kind of be it. But it was a fun way to wrap that up, and go. Because especially once they were wrestling around in the oatmeal and then Sarah gets on the horse and the whole thing was to shoot her with the fire hose. But we always had a problem on Attack where anything involving water pressure never went right. Drunk Iron Man was always one of our favorites because, he was supposed to throw up, and through the mask, he would just get a little, and we'd go, oh, it's not working again. And then, and it would just start going crazy, and then it would be shooting everywhere. And it happened almost every time, so you could always count on it. And then with the hose, with Sarah, when they go, all it did was just kind of trickle out a little bit. And I think she made a comment oh, Kevin, all it did was it just sprayed my tits or something like that. It sounded like something totally different. And Kevin just lost it, just started laughing. That was a fun one. The show was always fun. There were some things that they asked for, and that was always part of the challenge, was that they would ask for things that were way above what a show with no support and no budget, and everything, should be asking for. And the trick was to make it happen. And being not just on the crew and not being the technical director, but also being a fan, I want to see that happen. So when they'd come in, and I think the first one was they did a parody of 300, and that was in the old building, the Chelsea building we refer to it now. And they went all out with the makeup effects, and and the guys were looked like out of 300, and they had the costumes, and my job was to make the whole thing look like the film. And so I worked the effects, and luckily having a bit of a film background, I was able to kind of manipulate it. Same way every time we did Boba Fetish, they would always had to have a distinct film look, and so I would kind of do that and work my magic on it. Then sometimes just save the effects, so I could always call up my generic film effect and then just work it from there. So my job was always to kind of take it up, and honor the work that they put into it. And Mike Shaw was always fun, because he would be very creative, and he'd come up with these things that by all rights should not happen. Not on a show with no money and no support and no time. A lot of times I had to get an hour to kind of put something like this together, and then they were doing a parody of Watchmen, and they needed Dr. Manhattan. And as the day was going, it was getting more and more complicated. Like I'd say, oh, okay, I can work that out. And I get it worked out, and I take every effects bank I have, and it all gets worked out. And then they go, oh, it has to be live. Well, if it's got to be live, it means I have to compress it to one effects bank. So I had to rework the whole thing, get it down to one effects bank. And they said, oh, there has to be 4 of them now, out there. And I was like, okay. So I went and made 4 of them work. And then the whole thing was finally done. And they go, oh, and Allison Hayslip has to be green screened into it, talking to Dr. Manhattan. I was like, okay, let's go in and rebuild it, do it again. But I wanted it to look like the movie, because Mike was putting so much work into it. And I forget Ross, from X-Play, who was the big workout guy. He had him, playing Dr. Manhattan, and Emily did a beautiful job with the makeup, and they did such a great job. I wanted to, have it look like what they expected, So it was always do much more than we were really supposed to be doing, which I guess is why I was a fit for that job, They had a lot of people come through who could do that kind of thing, but they were like, "No, I'm not gonna do that every day. If I'm going to do that, I'm going to go out and make crazy money as a freelancer, and do it." And I loved the material. I loved the fact that we were doing movie parodies. I loved, when they did the Saw parody, at the old building, that it was so beautifully done. The sets looked like it, the makeup looked like it, it looked like film. That just being a part of that was always great. And so that was my enthusiasm, doing it. I got to be creative and contribute, and say, hey, I just came up with a thing, and we work it into the show. And so they gave me that latitude, which was always nice. But then a lot of times I'd build things and I wouldn't get any credit for it. And I would spend like 3 hours building something, and Alan was our director, and he'd be on his phone, like, looking at videos of his kid and stuff. And then, at the end of the day, the guys are, walking out, hey, nice job on that effect, Alan. And I'm like, okay, yay. So
what would you describe as maybe some of the worst moments on the show? I mean, there was these best moments, and everyone brings up the pie, but there were bad days too.
Mm-hmm.
I just remember, like, to me, Kevin's last day was, I felt that the show was over on his last day, but are there any sort of worst moments that you feel comfortable talking about?
Yeah, Kevin's last day was rough. Alan and I had always talked about it, and said that, with Olivia leaving, we always felt that, like, the co-host, as long as there was chemistry, that the co-host could change out and the show would go on. But we said if Kevin was to leave, that would be the end of the show. And then I put all my money down into a house, And 48 hours later, Kevin announced that he was leaving. I'm like, no, we can't do that. Which kicked off months of rumors back and forth about, we are being canceled, we're not being canceled. And the rumor mill was kind of getting crazy. Yeah, and it was getting to the point we couldn't do anything about it. There were a couple of people who actually left because they had an opportunity and they jumped ship and went. But most of us couldn't do anything about it. I said, look, it impacted me. I'm staying to the end anyway. So I really don't want to hear all these rumors. It's making me kind of sick. So it was a little bit of relief when they called everybody in the all hands meeting. Although I drove in from Studio City to Mid-Wilshire to the building the whole time, playing The Doors' The End over and over again. Just to have it in my head as we were going, doing that long walk upstairs. But it actually was a fun atmosphere with all of us together. And I think there was a lot of relief. There were a lot of people, saying, okay, now we know what's going on. And we had the official word, that it was going to be ending. And we had 2 months to ramp it down. And we had a lot of fun during those 2 months, going out. I mean, there's some stories there we can get into, but it's more fun stuff. I think the single worst day, and this is a story that I tell whenever I go to talk to classes, because sometimes I'll get invited to talk to like technical program classes and things, TV production classes and stuff. And I always tell this story. It's called Deep Fried Wednesday. And we walked in and found out that the plan that day was to have a deep fryer on the set. And throughout the show, they were going to be dropping various things into the deep fryer. So they were going to drop an iPhone. They were going to drop a game unit. They were going to drop an Elmo doll. And the Elmo doll was going to be very slow, and they were going to be having him go down, as he's going into the deep fryer. The fire marshal came in and said, you can't do that. You're going to poison everybody in the set because you're dropping plastic into a deep fryer. So now they had to move the whole thing outside, which wasn't planned for. And so they get everything outside. That took more time to do it. And then they blocked the whole thing. So this one camera guy was going to be handheld, and he was going to be up shooting down into the deep fryer. Well, when they showed him that, he said, I'm afraid of heights. I'm not getting on the ladder and doing it. So they had to reblock it again. And so they're doing this over and over again. We're losing all our prep time, and we're losing our rehearsal time. This was in the old building, and the old building had two bugs about it. One was that it was very old switchers, very old video consoles, that I'd be using, where sometimes one of the effects banks didn't work, and then we were also doing like fake green screens using the other control room. So we when people would have Los Angeles behind them or whatever city behind them, they were actually in the other studio using X-Play's control room to do the green screen that was coming to me as a camera. Sometimes that didn't work. And then all of the monitor fill animations on that set, for all of the expensive equipment that was out there, they had bought off-the-shelf, cheap, video server, software that constantly didn't work. It constantly failed. And you had to reboot the whole thing, reload everything, make it work again. So this whole thing is happening on my last day before I'm scheduled to go on vacation. I had talked to them many times about the server software for the animations failing. And now we're losing all our time because of all this reblocking and re-rehearsing. We finally get it down and we get into the show. And right before the commercial break, the animation goes and the fake green screen doesn't work. And so both of them fail, but everybody's focused on Deep Fried Wednesday. So I'm trying desperately to get the whole thing working, get it rebooted, and Gavin was the producer at the time. He was the executive producer, and he went on to be Jimmy Kimmel's, executive producer for many years. He's done a lot of great things since, but at the time he didn't know who I was. He just knew I was a fill-in, technical director. And he's screaming, why isn't it working? Why isn't it working? Make it work. Make it work. And Genji keeps trying to turn over to the back row behind him to say, Gavin, this isn't helping. Calm down. Let us work on it. He's working on it. Engineering's working on it. And Gavin just keeps yelling and screaming. Obviously, he's upset because his show is looking really bad. He's got a guest that's on a green background with no key behind him. He's got monitor animations that aren't playing. And finally, he just keeps screaming and screaming. And Genji, who's the most mild-mannered, even-keeled guy on the planet, just turns around menacingly because he's very tall, and he comes over the back of the console behind us, and he just gets in Gavin's face and just starts screaming, "Shut up, Gavin! Shut up! Shut the fuck up! Shut up!" And Gavin just cowers back, and just in silence, just shaking. All of us were shaking because we've never seen Genji like that, ever. And so that was kind of like, okay. And then I got everything fixed and it was done. And engineering knew right away what had gone wrong. And they came in to me and I just looked at her and I calmly said, if that video server is still here when I come back from vacation, don't book me again. I'm not doing this again. And after the show, Gavin storms out and he goes into Brent's office. You remember Brent was our boss. And he storms into the office and he starts just going crazy. This guy ruined the effect. He ruined the green screen. He ruined the show. And Brent actually had my back and engineering had my back and said, no, it was the bad equipment that we've warned you about over and over again. And by the way, thanks for noting, because he said, I've never seen this guy before. He's like, he's been here for 3 months and he's been our best fill-in. So thank you for noticing. But to Gavin's credit, when I came back from vacation, because I landed in Tampa the next day and I had 7 phone calls on my phone while I had been on the plane from various people around town going, I heard what happened yesterday. It had gone all over the place. And one of the other fill-ins who was covering while I was gone had said, thank you. They replaced it today. And it's gone. And we've been trying for months to get them to replace it. So thank you for doing that. But when I got back, Gavin came up and he apologized and introduced himself. And, we got along great from there. He was very nice the day that we did Alpaca Point Break, which was one of my favorite days. They brought in the alpaca and we were doing all of the Point Break bits with an alpaca on a green screen. And I had to make it surf and I had to make it, skydive and do all this stuff. And all of a sudden, when it aired, I got the email from Gavin saying, how did you do all that? But, so he was still enjoying the show, which was great. But that was the worst day. That was, it made for a fun story, but it was a horrible day. I left, thinking I'm fired. I'm done.
Now, let me ask a big question, which is kind of the whole question and the point of this documentary. This may take a while for you to answer, so just however concisely you can describe it, why did G4 end? Why was Attack of the Show canceled, and why did G4 end? My observation was always that they did not provide the support that they really needed to do. I mean, we had 2 great shows that had a very niche audience. That was specifically very smart, very tech savvy, and what they were trying to do is surround it with cops, and cheaters, and it shows they didn't have anything to do with it. And then when they finally did have the money, to do some pilots, and try to come up with some more shows to work around it, they did Hurl, which was, people having a food eating contest and then getting on an amusement ride to see how they would throw up. Or they did Ski Patrol or whatever it was that, it was a bunch of wannabe ski patrol people in a lodge together. I mean, stuff that didn't fit our audience at all. That's why toward the end, when they started, trying to experiment with the Esquire, what became the Esquire network. And I would just turn and look at them in the control room and say, our audience is people like me, who is wearing cargo shorts and a T-shirt and doesn't really care about fashion or fine liqueurs or any of this stuff, and why do you think it's going to be, worked into the show and work well? And it just didn't make any sense. So I think they just got further and further away from who our audience was, and not coming up with the support programming around it that people would stick around for, or that they would come in for as a warm up, for Attack, and kind of pre-show with that. They just didn't have it. And same thing with X-Play. So I think it was that kind of mismanagement. I mean, the E network people, once the merger had happened, didn't have any respect for G4.
They actually came to resent it because they didn't understand what it was. And I know there was a story where they were, the production was up on the floor near the elevators, where they sat, and the woman who was running everything had come in with the Kardashians. And she was embarrassed having to walk through the G4 section because of all the toys and the Squiddy costume and all the nerd stuff, And so she first had them all moved away from the elevators and out of sight, And then you could see that, they weren't going to develop and support for G4. They wanted it gone, and out of the way. So, I mean, I think, that's basically what happened. If they had saw that it was ahead of its time, and built programming around it, I think it could have kept going.
I mean, it's ironic now when you look at the marketplace. I mean, this is pre-Marvel movies being a thing, right? Like, this is still in the era of nerd culture isn't cool. It's something that you hide your comic book collection in shame, right? Like, that was sort of where G4 began, and it ended just as all of that was becoming cool.
Yeah.
And all of that was on the rise with like Marvel movies getting, 2012 saw the release. 2012 was the end of G4. It was also the last Batman film that by Chris Nolan, The Dark Knight Rises, and it was also the first Avengers movie was 2012. So just as G4 was ending, nerd culture was on the ascent. What can you say about the legacy of G4 and what it left? Like, it was ahead of its time, and just as its time had come, it was ended. What can you say about all of that?
Well, I wrote an email out to everybody on the last day, and just kind of expressing the experience of having been on the show for 6 years, and what it's meant, and also my hopes based on knowing that everyone had been kind of underused or underappreciated for how talented they were. And then my hope was that all these people were going to scatter, and we're going to basically take over the industry, and change everything. I think I compared it to like Show of Shows, where if you look at the writing room that came out of that show, and they dominated comedy for 40 years, or Dick Van Dyke, and then when you get Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner, and all these guys, that were the kings of comedy, for all that year. So I hope the same thing would kind of come from Attack. And we knew Jerry Duggan had already made a deal, with the comics, to do Guardians of the Galaxy. I think at that point they were doing James Gunn, who was on the show all the time. He had announced on Attack right before we got canceled that he was going to be doing Guardians of the Galaxy. And if you look at how Attack changed all of the late night shows, that all of a sudden now they were all having a game, and they were all having stunts. And, you look at what happened with Hardwick, with Talking Dead, that he did that with Heroes and some of the other shows. I think they did a Lost version of that, but they did all that on G4 long before, AMC. At the same time, that was one of the things that we looked at and said, like Comic Book Men, why did that end up on AMC and not on G4? That would have been a perfect show for G4. But with everybody going out and doing their thing and taking over, and I was really proud to see that, and see what everybody accomplished, how much they changed.
So much of in going through footage for the documentary, what I keep running across is, well, Kevin would get canceled for saying that, so and so would get canceled for saying that, I would get canceled for doing that. Could you even do a show like Attack of the Show today?
I don't, not in the same daily, like spirit, that we had. I think, again, a James Gunn reference to, the tweets that he made that he had apologized for and taken down But when they resurfaced and Disney took him off Guardians of the Galaxy 3, I was online making arguments that that was the humor at the time in this kind of nerd subculture, where there were dark jokes about things like that. And that wasn't unusual or inappropriate. We had a television show where we were doing those jokes. And to look at it now and say, that Pedo Bear was a regular gag on the show, that would not happen now. Or to have, the gag between Candace and Sarah, where every time Candace would say, "I'm so sure," Sarah would grab her and put her into her chest, and you wouldn't see things like that, going on. I think there's some of the other bits. I think the infamous fat suit, gag, which started off really clever and was going to be fun, and just ended up being like patently offensive. To the point, one of the E people was one of our production management, part was going to walk and was going to leave. And it ended up being bad spirit, but they got away with it. It got some laughs. It got brought back from time to time in clip reel shows. I don't think you could do that now. You'd have groups protesting and demanding that the show be canceled. And, there were a lot of things that we did like that on the show that I don't think you could do.
I mean, well, they don't have to worry about trying to cancel it. It's already canceled. I mean, whatever the new incarnation is going to be, it's just, it's not going to be what the old show was. It's and I also think that, part of the thing, we can focus on all the sort of salacious pie and motorboating aspects of the show, but truthfully, the reason I think it worked is there was a chemistry, with a lot of the people there. This, in particular, Kevin and Olivia had a chemistry. They had opposing strengths, Kevin, I think, was a terrible actor, but was the best TV host I've ever witnessed and ever worked with. And Olivia was almost, her being a host was acting in a sense. You know what I mean? Like, she was not seasoned as a host, but she was an amazing, it was and still is, an amazing actress. So she was able to act her way into being a host. So they had these kind of opposing skill sets. Their strengths and weaknesses complemented each other. Can lightning strike twice? Or in today's climate, could you even do a show like Attack of the Show?
I think it's going to be tough because, if the humor goes to where people who were nostalgic for the show want it to go, there's potentially, backlash for that. You may start to have co-hosts who start to say, "I'm feeling exploited. I'm feeling abused." To be, kind of blunt, Olivia did that when she was leaving, and she was going in the press and saying, "I was being abused and taken advantage of, and these people were perverts," and those were things she was saying, in the press. And I was going, I watched in these rehearsals where Olivia held her own and came up with things that were just as crazy as what they were suggesting, and she came up with it because she is a brilliant comedian. She's a great actress, but she's also a brilliant comedian. And that's why she was able to hold her own with Kevin, because she can play Blue just as much as him. And the two of them can go back and forth. And I think that's what kind of got lost, because, Candace was great, but, her humor didn't complement Kevin's. It was just kind of off on its own thing. She was more the "I'm pure and innocent," kind of thing. And she could play with Sarah and do these fun things and stuff. But with Kevin, she couldn't hold her own. Like, he would throw something really great at her, and then it would just kind of sit there. And he'd be like, "What am I going to do?" Olivia would have a response, and she'd come up with something even better, and hit back at him. I think the hot sauce night, the Cholula, incident, tells you everything you need to know about that relationship. Because, in rehearsals, we thought it was literally going to go like 2 shots, back and forth, and that Olivia will give up, and then that'll be it. Well, Kevin kept pushing it, saying, "I'm going to do another one because I want to make her do another one." And then he did it, and then she did another one. I think it ended up being 11 back and forth, and the two of them spent the night on the toilet, at her place, because she could hold her own. and do it. And she still is. She's very funny, And I think that's what got lost. And it made up for the things that, like that. She didn't know anything about video games or tech, or all she cared about was the BlackBerry. She'd be texting with people on the BlackBerry, and she loved that. And everything else kind of got fed to her through her earpiece, but she faked it, and she did a great job with it.
I will say that I kind of felt like she's the only one that could go up against Kevin, like for me, just witnessing Kevin, who I always felt was like the Bugs Bunny of the show. He was kind of like an instigator, right? And everyone, and so he was everyone's foil. And look, I held my own, but I could not. Kevin is a force of nature, but Olivia was the only one. And I remember her being as blue, if not more blue than Kevin at times. Like even I had exchanges with her on a DVD Tuesday, as weird as that sounds, where I couldn't believe like the stuff that she would just say. So it surprises me that she said that in the press, because there's plenty of evidence out there of things that she did on the show that like no one was forcing her to make these jokes. So that's a little surprising to me, but
and it hurt, because it was like, look, we all wanted to be very supportive of her leaving now to fully pursue her acting career, and it's like, we could have done that. If you look at when Kevin was leaving, it was like a month of celebration and remembering, and that, beautiful, as heartbreaking as it was, that beautiful ending, to the show with him and Mike Shaw did that amazing, film piece, with Kevin walking through his nostalgia museum and, and then getting shot at the end. But, it was a great way to send him off, to his new adventures. And I think we would have loved to have done that with her. But I think somewhere somebody was saying, if you're going to be a serious actress now, you've got to get away from the girl who jumped in the pie. You've got to get away from being the girl who deep-throated the hot dog on a tricycle. You're not going to get an Oscar, if you're doing that. I just didn't think that was necessary. And I think she could have just gone. It is great to see that they've kind of smoothed everything over. That her and Kevin are getting along again, and that there was talk of her potentially coming back, to do Attack again, and it's cool. And she's done some great stuff. Office Christmas Party is awesome. There's so many people that we worked with that are in that movie. TJ Miller, who raped our Christmas tree, right before the show ended. I don't know if anybody's talked about that story. That was I'll give you the quick. We were getting very close to the end, and Mike Costa was the guest host for a while. And he had his friends on, from the comedy circuit. And so he had Eric Andre on. And Eric Andre ended up, talking about his underwear or something. And the conversation kept pushing. He slowly kept like undoing his pants. And finally he got up and he dropped his pants and he had this underwear on, this funny underwear. And they were taking pictures. Candace is screaming, going on. And then he dropped the underwear. and this is live on the show. And poor Keith, who was our legal guy, he was the censor. He had a blur, and he had to put the blur up, which would blur the entire screen until whatever was going on ended on a 7-second delay. And we didn't want to lose the whole show and the whole incident to the blur. So I scrambled to make a little blur that I could manually track him with the joystick. And once I did that, then Keith lost his blur. Unfortunately, Keith passed away last year, and we always called him Cash Money, because he was just awesome. He was just a terrific guy, and he had been sick and passed away. But then the next day, after the Eric Andre thing, TJ Miller was coming on, and he was old friends with Mike Costa. And he was mocking the show the whole time, and he's making fun of Mike Costa, going, to think we all thought you were going to do so great, and now here you are in this G4 set where they can't even afford real fire because we had the monitor with the Christmas thing in it. And he kept making fun of it, and he kept making fun of all the pressure to drop his pants because of what Eric Andre had done. And we were like, oh, here we go again. And I had the blur ready to go. And, and he slowly started undoing the pants. And so he dropped his pants down to his underwear, and everybody's screaming and laughing, taking pictures. And And then he goes over to our Christmas tree and he's saying, and now you've ruined my life and reduced me to having to, fornicate with the secular meaning of Christmas. And he jumps on our Christmas tree and starts humping it, knocks it on the ground. And it was just chaos, and it was some of the funniest stuff we'd ever had on the show. But then the next day, the memo came out and said, if anyone else drops their pants, we're canceling you now. And the show's over. There will be no finales. There will be no, and I was just like, oh man, it would have been nice to get like some of the girls on their pants, and do that before it was over. But it didn't happen. So
can you tell me what was Olivia leaving? What was that like? Her, announcement, her like deciding to move on from the show. How did that all transpire? I know she made an announcement days before she announced she was leaving that she wasn't leaving. So can you talk about the circumstances of what led to her exiting the show?
Yeah, it had been obvious, for a while that she wanted to get out. There was an infamous Gadget Prawn rehearsal where, Kevin is doing all the work about, look at this phone. It does this and it does that. And you can do all these great things with it. And then we cut to Olivia and she's sitting there going, I'm bored. We were like, okay, at least try, and she was trying to, negotiate to not have to show up for rehearsals. And she wasn't staying for the Thursday night taping of the Friday shows. And so it was clear everybody knew she wanted out and she was focusing on, these other things that she was working on, which were great. We were all wishing her happiness with it. But when she came in, we all had heard the news that her mid-season replacement had been, picked up. And everybody wondered if she was going to stay. And she came in with this very, PR written, I am 100% committed to Attack of the Show. And everybody kind of laughed, like, okay, let's see how long that lasts. And she disappeared like the next day. And from there for like the next 6 months or 8 months, she showed up 4 times, twice to plug her book, once for Comic-Con because she was contractually obligated to do that. And then one more time. But the thing was, we never knew, is she officially leaving? Is she not leaving? They were casting for a replacement. And it was just a little crazier than it needed to be.
What about, like, I'm just looking at other hosts that you might be able to tell stories about. Allison Hayslip, which I'm of the personal opinion that I don't know why they didn't just hire Allison as Olivia's replacement. I think she was the natural fit. Do you have stories you can tell about Sarah and Allison and among and some of the others that were on the show? What sort of anecdotes or fun stories could you relay to us about them?
Well, from early on, when we were down at what we called the Chelsea building, that we were doing the shows at, and there were many doors, but they were all security locked, and there was only one entrance you were really supposed to come in and out of. And Zach Selwyn, I didn't know who he was really at the time, and he came up to the door outside the studio where I was talking to somebody, and he was pounding on the door saying, let me in, I got to get in, I'm late. And so I went over and I opened the door and let him in, and he said thanks, and he rushed off to where he had to be. And security came rushing down and told me, don't ever open that door, don't ever open that. I was like, hey, he was late, what are you going to do? But Zach was always fun. And Allison, I kind of agree that, I think for a long time everybody assumed, she was going to be Olivia's replacement. And it's kind of weird to say why. I mean, I heard a lot of things in the control room, where they weren't feeling that. I think in part because it was assumed so much, that it didn't leave them with any options or choices, that maybe they wanted to look for somebody, who was different. But Allison was always great. She, because she's from New Jersey and I'm from New Jersey, and Heather, our graphics operator, is from New Jersey. We used to make fun of Allison all the time, because the way, she said certain things like, buttons. She couldn't say buttons. It would always be buttons, and so we would always get on her about buttons. And, I still do it whenever I message her or if I see her out in public or something like that. I'm like, buttons. And Heather, did the same thing. so she was always fun. And I always assumed Jessica Chobot was going to be the replacement, for Olivia, because I just felt that she kind of nailed everything. She was a fun actress. She was good personality. She could hold her own with Kevin. She knew all the tech stuff. And she knew games, and she knew, and I just thought that she was a great replacement. And I think she just had one bad day, and that one bad day cost her the gig, which is a shame, because otherwise I kept plugging for her. I kept saying she's the one. She would be the great replacement. And Sarah was fun. Yeah, I think Sarah was just a surprise because she didn't do that great in her auditions, but then they hired her to do the feed, and then she kind of grew into it, and she developed her personality, and now she could hold her own with Kevin. And I think there were a lot of people saying that if she had had that during the audition process, she may have been the co-host, when Olivia left. But she just needed some time to kind of grow into it and find it. And I love her Instagram. She goes around camping naked all over the place. So that's pretty great. I think she found her gig. And I think who else? Layla. Yeah, Layla was always fun too. The best Layla story was when they were doing the bit with the taxidermy squirrels. And she was playing around like they're so fun. They look so real. They're so cute. And then somebody explained to her, they said, that's a real stuffed squirrel. It's a dead animal. And she was freaking out, and she had to wash her hands and do it. So she was fun. And there were some, you want to hear about some of the bad hosts, like during the fill-in, stuff. Oh my God. Neil Brennan, when he filled in, and I was the only one who was really excited. Neil Brennan was filling in for a week. It was supposed to be 2 weeks, actually, when he came in. And I was super excited because he was a co-writer and co-creator on Chappelle's show. And he had been responsible for some of the really funny bits and working with Dave. And it was just awesome. So I said, this is going to be a lot of fun. And I was telling people who he was. And then he came in and he brought in a team of writers. And he didn't seem to really want to be there. And he just had this bad attitude toward everything. And I was devastated. And everybody was going, what is this? It's like he's crapping on the show. It's like he doesn't want to be here. And so they cut it short, and they had him stop coming in because it just wasn't funny. It wasn't working. And it was kind of killing the whole vibe with everybody. Kumail Nanjiani was great. He was a lot of fun at the time. Everybody just knew that him and Emily loved playing video games. And they were working on another show, for it. Nobody had any idea he was going to be this big superstar. And, like when I watched The Big Sick, and I just kept thinking, oh my God, now I'm finding out their whole story. This is awesome.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about Kumail, and then also some of the other like guest hosts that came in. And then the other thing I want to hear is, can you talk about like, what's weird is how many people came on the show that became big, that were like fans of the show, like James Gunn being among them, like some of the other guest spots. So talk a little bit about Kumail, some of the other guest hosts that didn't quite work out, and then some of the other guests. And I'm going to mute myself.
I think, during that whole period, we kept having, to look at it. And I think everybody was saying that, a lot of the guest hosts, they did one thing really well, or they did a couple of things really well, but they didn't do everything, as well as they needed to. And I think with Kumail, it was maybe the interviewing that, that wasn't that strong. But obviously the acting was very strong and the comedy was strong. Like Mark Maron, the interviewing was phenomenal, but he wasn't good with the tech stuff, and he wasn't good, with some of the other stuff. And he's got one very distinct acting kind of personality, that for the wild gigs on Attack just didn't work, but he was fun to work with, because we all knew the podcast. So I ended up seeing him at the screening for Lynn Shelton's movie. Sadly, she passed away last year. And he ended up referring to me repeatedly as that weirdo with the TV camera, because I was doing my Front Row Flynn thing. So I put that now as my quote, my brand thing, that weirdo with the TV camera, Mark Maron. trying to think. I'm blanking on the name. Let me look it up real quick. Rob Delaney.
Rob Delaney. He was great.
Rob Delaney. I think he was one of the first guest hosts that we had, and he was very funny. He was terrific. I don't know why they didn't end up going with him. Yeah, and sometimes it was just hard to tell. I think Baratunde Thurston ended up going over to take part live with a lot of the Attack people afterward. He was very good. There were a bunch of them. John Harriman was hysterical. Until took his genitals out, but he was a lot of fun, and it was very nice. And the thing was, like, at the time, I knew he was on Doctor Who and Torchwood because I kept hearing about it, but I had never watched either show until after we were all laid off, and now I had a lot of time. So I went back and watched all of Doctor Who, and I was like, oh, now I get it. Now, I mean, he is just absolutely amazing in that part of Captain Jack. And Torchwood was a great series too. So I was like, now I get it. Now I was actually really impressed with the fact that, hey, I had to, talk with this guy out in the hallway for Thanksgiving. It was just me, Heather, and him and his boyfriend, and we just had a great conversation. It was cool. At the time, I just wasn't that phased with who he was.
Tell me a little bit about your perspective of the legacy of G4. I'm of the belief that I think that YouTube, actually G4 proved that you could have no real television experience, just have a passion and expertise for something and be able to talk about it. And I feel like the legacy of G4 is the growth of YouTube creators and people doing their own content, whether they're talking about comic books or movies or video games. I think G4 inspired the generation that's currently on YouTube, talking about all of those things. You kind of find the person whose voice you connect with, and then, that's it. I feel like G4 was the beginnings of that, because YouTube was not what it is today back when G4 started or at least when Attack of the Show started in 2005 and G4 started in 2002. So what do you feel is the legacy that's been left? And speak to first the legacy, and then also talk about, if you wouldn't mind, your perspective on how fandom has changed, and fan culture, and how it's changed from the group that used to gather and watch Attack together to where fandom is today. If you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, as far as the legacy, goes, you're exactly right. I mean, when we were pulling clips off YouTube to run for Around the Net, it was usually, backyard wrestling gone bad, or, the guy shooting the gun, from his waist, a whole bunch of times. And, the guy who used to let people kick him in the balls, and things like that. And it was just, funny, goofing off stunt, kind of stuff. And now you see just this huge field of, people who are trying to do Attack of the Show or X-Play. They're trying to do, the funny, look at all the clips off the internet, or they're talking about video games, and their video game reviews are very much like X-Play, was. And, I think you see that love for what we were doing, out there. And I mean, I can only speak like for my own channel. I do things all the time that I think, oh, that's exactly what we would have done on Attack. Like I did a Q&A for Crawl, the alligator movie Sam Raimi produced. And our friend Gray Drake was moderating the Q&A, and it was a great Q&A, but the writers of the film were the Rasmussen brothers, and there was a gag that developed naturally between Sam and Alexandra, the director, and Gray, and where they kept throwing out Rasmussen, and do it, and everybody would cheer, and it would be a big reaction. And so when I was doing the video, I created a stamp, with that very Germanic heavy metal, Rasmussen with a red outline. And so every time they would say it, I would fly it in, stamp it, and with a hammer sound effect, Rasmussen. And I got done looking at it and going, that's exactly what we would have done on Attack. That would have been a gag the whole time. Like when we did the Widowmaker, and Kevin came out with the remote, the little battery powered car with the dildo on the front of it. and I kept flying in Widowmaker, and it was that kind of thing. So I think it's always out there on these YouTube videos where people like want to be doing, that kind of thing because they miss what we were doing. And so, the legacy obviously goes out to broadcast shows as well. Like we were saying, all these late night shows that emulated Attack, interview shows, that did it. It's kind of been a little bit of a backlash now because you see, like some people criticizing those shows, saying that it seems like every late night show and talk show now is like a 5-year-old's, birthday party. And, so I'm like, well, we're responsible for that. We did it. Yay. And even that, that was always a gag in the show where something negative would happen and we would make it sound like it was fun. And we go, we did it. And, the graphic would fly in. And we do it all the time in emails, or I'll post it up like the news had come out that the, age group of like 14 to 49 was most responsible for spreading COVID. And I put it, we did it. Yay. With the little graphic on it. And when something funny happens, it's like, there were the couple that was trying to get drug money in the convenience store, and it goes bad. And she runs to the back of the store, and she climbs up on the shelves into the ductwork up above, and she ends up falling through the ceiling right in front of the police. And we created an entire email chain that day that was all Attack of the Show people going, oh, my God, this would have so been around the net. And Jerry, Duggan had sent out the clip thing, and I took it and I put a keyboard cat on it, and yakety sax, so you had the whole thing going, and that was all totally Attack. I mean, that's it's exactly what we all would have done. So it still lives on almost 10 years later, and still goes, and all of these kids kind of doing the same thing, where their YouTube is much more polished and much more a look of a show and a feel of a show than just getting on and having some guy kick him in the nuts, and do it. So
let's not discount kicking and getting kicked in the nuts. It's
still good.
It's still funny.
Yeah.
It's still, I think it's something that probably won't get you canceled too. You could, you could do that bit, but you're right. Like late night, especially with Gavin Purcell going to Jimmy Fallon, was completely like, they started doing like bits that would have been on AOTS, like for sure. What, like, just to pull it all together and put it in perspective, are there any questions I didn't ask or stories that you feel the need to tell that I didn't ask a specific question that you'd like to impart?
You want the Emmy Rossum story?
I want whatever story you got. Oh, yeah,
I've got two.
Two final stories to close us out. Great.
The Emmy Rossum story is pretty horrible. It was she was coming on the show to promote a film she had done while she was still on Shameless, and I was very excited because I'm a big fan, and so I was looking forward to her being there and doing the show. And then we got word that her agent and manager had said, we're never bringing her back here ever again, because they had put her in the green room. And when she sat on the couch, she had discovered that there was jizz on the couch. And there's what is going on here? What kind of place is this? And so she said she was doing the interview and that was it. She was never coming back. And they found out that one of the security guards had been going into that room at night when nobody was around and had been having a hand party, and to quote Borat. So that was a pretty bad, embarrassing incident, but it was also funny. Only Attack would that happen. But then there was Zombieland, and that went horribly wrong. They had brought it because they were having Jesse Eisenberg and Emma Stone in to promote the movie. And I was a big fan of Emma Stone from Superbad. And so I was excited she was coming in and doing it. And they had 2 clown heads that were done up like zombies. And the idea was that they would shoot the fake blood into the mouth of the clown head and it would blow up a balloon. And then the first one who, gets the balloon filled all the way wins. Well, they came in and they agreed to do it. and we did the stunt. And the thing was, the balloons exploded and the blood shot back on them. And it turned out that the publicists had gotten Emma Stone this new expensive dress, and they had a whole schedule of appearances they were going to be doing that day. We were the first ones. And so when the blood shot back and got all over the dress, the publicist had a fit, and the whole thing's done. And our guys asked if they would be okay with doing another take because it didn't go exactly as they had wanted. And the publicist said, absolutely not. We're taking them out of here right now. And off they went. We're like, yay. another big day on Attack of the Show. And I got to see them when they were leaving, in the hallway, which was cool.
There were more than a few publicists that left dissatisfied.
I think they just didn't get the show. I think they didn't get what they were walking into. And, sometimes they came into something like that. And I'm trying to remember specifics where, the publicist or somebody didn't want them to do the stunt, but they really wanted to do it. There's a couple off the top of my head, but I can't remember the specifics on it. Where they said, no, I want to do it. I want to.
I've had an ongoing battle with Hollywood publicists. Having dealt with them in the past, not always my favorite type of people to deal with, though. So lacking a profound sense of humor, I would say. But they might have prepared them better with, let her know, have a stunt dress, possibly. But, wow, that's a crazy story. Well, anything else? And also, Chris, first of all, let me just thank you for doing this interview. I really appreciate it. I can't wait for you to see the finished doc.
Yeah, I can't either. It's great. I was excited when you said you were going to do this because I thought it's another thing about the legacy, that there would be interest in people just kind of looking back and reflecting on, how much fun Attack was, and G4 and X-Play. And
there'll never be anything like it again, really.
No, I've gotten into conversations.
You can use the name, but I don't know if there'll be anything like it.
No, it's because people have been talking about it, and I kind of compare it to Hostess. Remember when Hostess was going out of business and people freaked out and said, "Oh my God, no more Twinkies, more cupcakes," and then this other company came in and bought it and kind of relaunched the brand. And if you buy them now, they're not Twinkies; they're like fun size Twinkies, or fun size cupcakes. They kind of taste the same, a little bit, but they're not the same. It's its own new thing that a whole new group appreciates, and they'll grow up thinking those are Twinkies, and and they'll be happy, and but other people remember the days when there were other Twinkies that were much bigger and much more fun. So,
all right, thank you again, Chris. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. This has been awesome.